Good afternoon, those of you who are here, and also to those of you who are watching this on the live stream. My name is Rasmus Søndergaard, and I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS, where I work on US foreign policy, specialized in areas of human rights and democracy promotion, so quite a bit of overlap with today's talk, which I've been very much looking forward to. We have here with us William Michael Schmidli from Leiden University, and he will be talking about his forthcoming book, Freedom on the Offensive, Human Rights, Democracy Promotion, and US Interventionism in the Late Cold War. As you can see in the program, I have put myself up here for about 10 minutes of introduction, and after introducing Mike, I will say a few words also on, you could say, sort of the historical context in the lead up to Mike's talk, to try and give a bit of context there. I hand over the floor to Mike then, and then we have an open discussion session at the end with plenty of time for Q&A from the audience as well. William Michael Schmidli is an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Prior to that, he was at Bucknell University in Pennsylvania in the US. He has also had fellowships at Princeton, at Helsinki, and now he has a research fellowship at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, working on this forthcoming book. He has a PhD from Cornell. He published his first book with Cornell University Press in 2013, The Fate of Freedom Elsewhere, Human Rights and US Cold War Policy Towards Argentina. He then also co-authored or co-edited this book, The Reagan Administration, the Cold War, and the Transition to Democracy Promotion, and he's published extensively in various academic journals as well. So he is very, very well positioned to talk to us about today's topic. Just a brief advertisement for what we're doing here at DIIS. We have this fall a theme that we do on democracy in development or decline, in which we have various events, publications, etc., that try to grapple with this so-called current crisis of liberal democracy and asks sort of how did we get here and where is democracy headed. And for today's talk, I think we could get at least some words towards the way of answering the question, like how did democracy or liberal democracy end up in the current crisis, if we accept that that's what it is in. Certainly, I think when reading about the current liberal democracy crisis, this seems to be, you could almost say it's the Reagan democracy crisis. There's quite a bit of overlap between the way that Reagan understood democracy in terms of limited government and free markets, etc. That is sort of the dominating model of liberal democracy today that is increasingly under pressure from within and without. But I will try to give just a short introduction to give a little bit of historical context that might be helpful for those who are less familiar with sort of the field of human rights in American foreign policy. And I'm doing that by posing this question: why all this talk of human rights in US foreign policy? Human rights is a pretty sort of omnipresent concept, as we all know today, in debates of foreign policy, international affairs, etc. Certainly the current US administration talks a great deal about democracy and human rights. And the question maybe seems counterintuitive in the sense that, of course, human rights should be part of American foreign policy, given that the United States was established as an experiment in democracy based on Enlightenment principles, civil liberties, etc. And of course we have the Declaration of Independence and the US Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution. So there is this rights talk, and democracy is obviously a key word in the American political tradition. But I would suggest, though, that when it comes to human rights, it is not a key concept in American foreign policy until much, much later. What I've taken here just to illustrate is a Ngram viewer from Google. For those who are not familiar with it, it basically allows you to search for words and concepts across Google's catalog of digitized books. And what I've done here is to search for human rights in English language publications. I've omitted the first 200 years of American history because, well, there's very little traction on the concept of human rights if you look at it there. And that is simply to show you when is it that human rights emerge in American and English literature as a concept. We see a little bump here in the late 40s, pans out somewhat, increases significantly in the late 70s, and then sort of stays more or less at the same level at sort of where we are today, which is human rights as this sort of concept that's frequently invoked in American political debates and here in Europe and elsewhere as well. And this correlates quite well, I think, with when human rights sort of gains traction in American foreign policy. And so there's a debate in the literature on the sort of origins of human rights in general as well as in the US. But I do think we can, without entering that debate, it's fair to say that human rights in its modern form, so modern international human rights as we know them today, really emerged, of course, with the Universal Declaration, and in the birth of that declaration, along with the United Nations, the US played a rather prominent role along with other countries. And here we see Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the US, who chaired the committee that drafted the declaration. So this is to show you that the US was present at least at the drafting of the international human rights documents. It also shows you who was involved. It was predominantly an elite project. There was limited sort of broader social engagement with human rights at the time in the US. And American attention to human rights in the 40s was really centered on the UN and international organizations and not so much integrated into US bilateral foreign policy. And that remains the case in the following decades. There's a lot of factors that go into that. Mainly it's the US being preoccupied with the Cold War and getting less interested in the United Nations, and human rights simply doesn't feature that prominently in American foreign policy debates in the 50s and into the 60s. Then when we get to the late 60s into the 70s, we have what you could call a sort of American rediscovery of human rights. Other countries have been paying attention to human rights and participating vigorously in human rights debates at the UN throughout the 60s. But the US has somehow taken a back seat for quite a while, but re-emerges then in the 1970s, regains interest in human rights, both on a sort of broader social movement level, significantly, of course, Amnesty International and other human rights NGOs that really sort of increased their membership and influence over the 1970s, but also through policymakers. Members of Congress like Dan Fraser, sitting over here to my far left, Dan Fraser, he introduces human rights concerns into American foreign policy to a degree that hadn't happened before the 1970s. And that sort of establishes the foundation for human rights and democracy in US foreign policy in the 80s, which is what Mike will be talking about. But what members of Congress do in the 70s is that they establish the Human Rights Bureau at the US State Department that we know today, introduces so-called country reports on human rights, where the executive branch is required to report to Congress on human rights situations across the world, and also mandates people in the various regional departments of state to work on human rights issues. So human rights issues is integrated into US foreign policy in the 70s in a way it wasn't before, connected to foreign aid, trade relations, etc. Where it really sort of shifts gear is with the arrival of Jimmy Carter in 1976, who, basically becomes the sort of the person that most people, I think, associate with the US and human rights, in historical terms at least, when he introduces what he names a human rights-based foreign policy. And I won't go on about that at length, just to say that it has to do with reintroducing an element of morality in US foreign policy, breaking with the foreign policy of his predecessors, Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, trying to make Americans feel good about themselves again after the Vietnam War, and picking up on a moral concept that is sufficiently limited and malleable to fit his agenda, which deals with re-establishing better American relations with the global South countries and trying to break out of the sort of East-West Cold War contestation to some extent as well. Ronald Reagan did not approve. I think Mike will go into a bit more about both Carter's human rights policy and certainly Ronald Reagan. So just by way of that, I will end, and I will hand over the floor to you, Mike, and hope that you can show us what happened when Ronald Reagan entered office.
Thanks, Rasmus. Okay. Hello, and thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here today, and you know, it's great to actually be here in person after so many Zoom meetings. So I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you today. So when Ronald Reagan took office in January of 1981, his administration was intent on removing human rights as a policy priority. The administration was focused on rolling back the perceived communist gains that had in their eyes taken place over the 1970s, but especially during the Carter years. Building up American military strength was another priority, as well as pushing neoliberal economic policies abroad. And human rights were seen as, you know, the sort of meat and potatoes of Jimmy Carter's policy failures, his sort of weakness as a liberal internationalist, and so Reagan had criticized Carter on the issue of human rights during the campaign, and in the first months in office, the Reagan administration sought to get rid of, or at least minimize, the importance of human rights as a U.S. foreign policy priority. Yet by late 1981, sorry, my microphone feels like it's trying to walk off my head. By late 1981, the Reagan administration had come to the conclusion that simply removing human rights as a foreign policy priority was neither possible nor politically savvy. Human rights had become too entrenched in the U.S. Foreign policy making process, and the non-governmental human rights community had become too powerful a force to simply steamroll in the name of anti-communism. More importantly, the Reagan administration increasingly recognized that human rights was not a monopoly held by liberal internationalists, that human rights could be used to advance U.S. foreign policy priorities by the Reagan White House. By reframing human rights as democracy promotion, free market economics, and anti-communism, the human rights issue could be used to advance Reagan's own foreign policy agenda. Is it better? Okay. Sorry. So my forthcoming book, oh, that's much louder. My forthcoming book is tentatively titled Freedom on the Offensive, Human Rights, Democracy Promotion, and U.S. Interventionism in the Late Cold War. And I argue in this book that Reagan's embrace of democracy promotion as the centerpiece of the U.S. human rights policy was really a defining development in U.S. foreign relations in the late 20th century. Reagan used democracy promotion to refashion the bipartisan consensus that had collapsed in the late 1960s amid opposition to the Vietnam War. And over the course of the 1980s, I argue, the democracy promotion initiative led to a greater institutionalization of human rights in U.S. foreign policy, but in a very narrow way, excluding social and economic rights and centering on political rights and civil liberties. So democracy promotion served to legitimate a distinctive form of U.S. interventionism and to underpin the Reagan administration's aggressive Cold War foreign policies. And in my book, I use Reagan's undeclared war on Nicaragua as a case study in American interventionism, and I explore how democracy promotion emerged as the centerpiece of human rights, but also how U.S. foreign policy and U.S. human rights policy became intertwined with deeply undemocratic practices that misled the American people, that violated U.S. law, and contributed to immense human and material destruction. So here's what I'm going to talk about in terms of the contents. I'm delighted to spend the next few minutes talking about some of these key ideas in my book. Let's begin with what human rights meant to the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration frequently used this term human rights, but what the administration really meant by this was a narrow form of democracy, neoliberal economic policies, and anti-communism. And you can see here that social and economic rights, which had been championed by throughout the Cold War by the communist world and in the 1960s and 1970s by many third world nationalists, this was largely excluded from the Reagan administration's human rights framework. And so in the communist world, wrote Joseph Shatten, who was a right-wing intellectual who served as an influential speechwriter for both Jeane Kirkpatrick and Elliott Abrams. From the government's point of view, this is a quote, the reason its subjects receive free education and medical care is in no way different from the reason its tractors receive mechanical care. If the services weren't provided, the machine, either animate or inanimate, wouldn't work. In such circumstances, the economic rights of citizens under communism makes about as much sense as to speak of the economic rights of automobiles to gasoline. Similarly, Elliott Abrams asserted that you could make the argument that there aren't many countries where there are gross and consistent human rights violations except the communist countries, because they have the system itself. While the Reagan administration emphasized democracy promotion in particular, the administration also defined democracy in a very specific way. The administration understood democracy to mean elections, right? Regular elections, the protection of civil liberties, but also a free market economy and protecting the interests of corporate capitalism. This was understood to be an essential ingredient for a functioning democracy. And again, you can see here that this model of democracy de-emphasized questions of social and economic inequality, and by emphasizing a direct relationship between market logic and democratic process, it delegitimized alternative models of democracy that understood social and economic inequality as an impediment to democracy. And of course, more to the point, this emphasis on democracy fit with the Reagan administration's hardline approach to the Cold War. And you can see in this the 1983 introduction to the State Department's country reports on human rights. The report stated that while non-communist dictatorships are capable to varying degrees of evolving into democracies, communist dictatorships are singularly resistant to democratization. So for the Reagan administration, promoting human rights required a robust commitment to the global containment of communism, even if it meant supporting right-wing dictatorships. And so what I'm basically saying is that democracy promotion is the centerpiece of the US human rights policy. It served to legitimate the Reagan administration's call to roll back perceived communist gains in the developing world. So let me turn to Nicaragua, which is the case study for this book that I'm finishing up. Nicaragua provided a kind of testing ground for the democracy promotion initiative. In the pre-revolution era, before the Nicaraguan Revolution of 1979, decades of greed, corruption, and nepotism at the hands of the Somoza dictatorship, backed by the United States, had left Nicaragua one of the most impoverished and unequal nations in Latin America. The 1979 revolution was a popular uprising against the Somoza dictatorship. It led to the overthrow of Somoza and a revolutionary government taking power, but it resulted in enormous destruction. Right? 50,000 lives were lost, a fifth of the population was left homeless, another 40,000 were orphaned. Yet as the tens of thousands of Nicaraguans celebrated the revolution's final victory in July of 1979, it was clear that the revolutionary government had widespread popular support. And although individual members of the Sandinista front, the revolutionary government, advanced a diverse range of ideas, influenced by interpretations of Marxist-Leninism, the ideas of the Nicaraguan nationalist Augusto Sandino, the example of the Cuban Revolution. I would argue that they all shared a vision of transforming Nicaragua in the post-Somoza era, in the post-dictatorship era, by extending social and economic rights to ordinary Nicaraguans. Rather than trickle-down economics, as a member of the Ministry of Planning asserted in 1981, quote, "We're trying to develop a planned mixed economy. Before we always operated under the trickle-down economic premise. Now we want a trickle-up economy, with the first cause to be the bottom 50% of the people." On the political front, the revolutionary government envisioned a balance between top-down vanguardism, and a form of direct democracy in which non-elites could participate in the nation's political life through newly created mass-based organizations at the grassroots level. And I want to emphasize this notion of participatory democracy rooted in social and economic rights as central to the FSLN, the revolutionary government's project. For the Reagan administration, confronting revolutionary Nicaragua was a top priority. And this may seem kind of counterintuitive to us today, given the amount of attention that's placed on, Reagan and the Soviet Union, summit meetings between Reagan and Gorbachev, the end of the war, the end of the Cold War sort of narrative. But in fact, if you go back and look at what Reagan officials were saying in the early 1980s and throughout the decade, Nicaragua was seen as a top priority. It was perceived as part of the East-West confrontation. It was an opportunity to roll back Soviet gains in the Third World. And in what became known as the Reagan Doctrine, administration hardliners wanted to use Nicaragua as a way to turn the tables on the Soviet Union by supporting anti-communist wars of national liberation. So by the end of 1981, the Reagan administration had established a framework for destabilizing Nicaragua that would span the 1980s. Within a couple of years, US funded counter-revolutionary forces, known as the Contras, had grown to a force of 7,000 combatants and were regularly attacking targets across northern Nicaragua. And the numbers, we don't really know how many Contras there were, but somewhere around 15,000 at their peak. These counter-revolutionaries systematically used assassination, torture, rape, and kidnapping to demoralize Sandinista sympathizers, and they targeted clinics, schools, and cooperatives to drain the revolutionary government of scarce resources and sow disillusionment among the rank and file of Nicaraguan rank and file. So the Reagan administration's undeclared war on Nicaragua illuminated how human rights could serve American Cold War goals. First, the administration repeatedly accused the Sandinistas, the revolutionary government, of supporting leftist insurgencies that threatened regional democracies. And so using this narrative of Nicaragua is a rogue actor undermining regional democracy, the White House warned of the possibility that the Sandinistas would gain regional dominance, and with Cuban support would threaten the entire region, including the Panama Canal Zone. Second, whether they were describing skirmishes between Contras and Sandinista draftees on the Honduran border, or the possibility of a Soviet delivery of advanced weaponry like MiG fighter jets, the Reagan administration used this tactic of inversion, accusing Nicaragua of militarism while trying to hide its own hand in supporting the counter-revolutionaries. And then I think this is particularly important, that the Reagan administration used the language of human rights, especially relating to democracy promotion, to criticize Nicaragua for denying political rights and civil liberties. And so just eliding the economic, social, and economic achievements of the revolutionary government, the Reagan administration consistently focused on issues like freedom of the press, particularly censorship of the opposition newspaper, La Prensa. Excuse me. The Reagan administration accused the Sandinistas of illegally detaining perceived subversives, compared Nicaraguan political prisoners to captives in a Soviet gulag. Nicaragua, Reagan asserted many different times and in many different ways, Nicaragua was a totalitarian dungeon. Right? When the revolutionary government announced that elections would be held in November of 1984, the Reagan administration, which had consistently criticized Nicaragua for failing to uphold the sort of democratic norms, being an outlier, being a rogue state, when the revolutionary government announced elections, the Reagan administration responded 4 months before the election by accusing the Sandinistas of fraud. Right? Reagan described the election as a Soviet-style sham, and after the US-backed opposition candidate withdrew from the race, the State Department released a report dismissing the elections out of hand. And it's worth noting that this was a heavily scrutinized election. It was judged by international observers to be basically as free and fair as the election in El Salvador that had happened a couple years before, that the US had endorsed. But the White House was consistent in describing this as a sham. I have one thing to say, Reagan told reporters, it's a phony. So what does this mean? The rejection of the election, it revealed this, sort of black and white worldview that Reagan approached the Cold War with, and this view of sort of the guys in the white hats and the guys in the black hats, the East-West confrontation as really the defining paradigm. This undergirded the administration's democracy promotion initiative. And so, according to this logic, the Nicaraguan government could not, by definition, be democratic. If it was indeed an ally of the Soviet Union, if it was indeed pursuing these communist goals, part of this broader global Cold War, it couldn't be democratic. The Sandinistas are communists, therefore such agreements are lies. Elliot Abrams, who was initially the head of the Human Rights Bureau and then moved to the Latin America Bureau in the State Department, asserted, and he's talking about negotiations with the United States or with the international community. It is preposterous, he argued, to think that we can sign a deal with Nicaragua to meet our foreign policy concerns and expect it to be kept. Right? So you have this problem here, where the U.S. is promoting democracy, but views places like Nicaragua as incapable of ever becoming democratic with the current leadership in charge. I argue that the Reagan administration's democracy promotion initiative, reached its peak in early 1986. The Secretary of State, George Shultz, played a very important role in this process, fusing this vision of rolling back communist gains with the liberal internationalist appeal of promoting democracy abroad. and also aligning the United States rhetorically behind this wave of democratization that was occurring in the developing world, especially in Latin America. And U.S. The U.S. policy toward Haiti and toward the Philippines in early 1986, where the U.S. withdrew support from these two dictatorships that had long been allied with the United States. This is a very important moment for the Reagan administration in winning liberal support in this democracy promotion project. And in March of 1986, shortly after the Haiti and Philippines, after the U.S. withdrew support from these dictatorships, Reagan embraced what he described as the democratic revolution in this very defining address to a joint session of Congress. Reagan famously asserted, "The American people believe in human rights and oppose tyranny in whatever form, whether of the left or the right." So these actions on Haiti and the Philippines, combined with this very powerful rhetoric, signaled a shift away from the administration's rejection of human rights at the beginning of the 1980s, and it also, and I think very importantly, won support on Capitol Hill. By mid-1986, Congress had continued to fund the National Endowment for Democracy. It had augmented U.S. support for anti-Soviet fighters in Afghanistan. It had repealed the legislation prohibiting covert operations in Angola, and it had legislated military assistance to non-communist resistance fighters in Cambodia, in addition to funding the Contras operating on the borders of Nicaragua. So the point is that by 1986, the administration's emphasis on democracy promotion as the core of the human rights policy had made significant steps toward rebuilding this bipartisan Cold War consensus that had fallen apart in the late 1960s. And you know, this is, I think, really key to understanding the changes to American foreign policy that occur in the late Cold War and indeed the late 20th century. But even as the Reagan administration was refashioning this Cold War consensus, the interventionism that was at the heart of this democracy promotion initiative very nearly destroyed the Reagan presidency. And I won't go into great detail on the Iran-Contra scandal, but very simply, beginning in late 1986, the revelations of this scandal revealed that the White House had solicited funding from wealthy American conservatives and friendly foreign governments to support the Contras. The administration had violated U.S. law by secretly shipping arms to Iran in exchange for promises that hostages held by Iranian terrorists in Lebanon would be released. And a National Security Council staffer, Oliver North, had illegally diverted profits from the sale of these arms to the Contras, which North described as a contribution. Now, you know, amid the spectacle of the Iran-Contra hearings, the relationship between these illegalities and the democracy promotion initiative were largely obscured. But from the outset, Washington's war on Nicaragua was undertaken in the spirit of a human rights policy that defined communism as the ultimate human rights violation and justified U.S. efforts to orchestrate a regime change. And it was no coincidence that Oliver North, working at the NSC, referred to his expansive web of black operations in Central America with offshore bank accounts, dummy corporations, ships and airplanes. He described all of this as Project Democracy. So, how should we understand Reagan's human rights policy with its overriding emphasis on democracy promotion? First, as I've mentioned, the administration effectively used democracy promotion to refashion a bipartisan Cold War consensus, or we can say foreign policy consensus. And again, I think that this is a really important development in US foreign relations in the late 20th century. Second, during the 1980s, human rights were increasingly institutionalized in the formulation and implementation of US foreign policy. Now, again, they're narrowly framed as civil rights, political rights, and civil liberties. But nonetheless, human rights by the end of the 1980s had become increasingly embedded as a US policy priority across the vast foreign policy bureaucracy. And, you know, the results were at times quite unpredictable. At the same time that human rights talk was influencing US pressure on the Soviet bloc and its allies, it was also contributing to decreased US support for some right-wing dictatorships, such as the Philippines, Chile, and South Korea. And so what is happening here is that, you know, combined with political aid from the National Endowment for Democracy, by the end of the 1980s, democracy promotion had evolved into this singular form of US interventionism that was underpinning broader US strategic goals. Third, despite the Iran-Contra scandal, which was a serious threat to the Reagan administration and is often overlooked as we sort of jump straight to the end of the Cold War, despite the Iran-Contra scandal, the undeclared war on Nicaragua dealt the Nicaraguan Revolution really a mortal blow. It immiserated Nicaraguans in a war that claimed more than 30,000 lives, had an economic cost as high as $2.5 billion. By 1988, inflation in Nicaragua had reached 33,000%. The combined with opposition within Nicaragua to government policies such as a national military conscription, by the end of the 1980s, Nicaraguans were really yearning for peace, stability, and economic opportunity. And I think it's important to note that it was the George W. Bush administration that fulfilled the Reagan administration's promise to oust the revolutionary government. In the lead up to the 1990 election, the Bush administration played a central role in bringing together a number of very diverse opposition parties into a single coalition, providing funding and also continuing U.S. funding for the Contras. And in the 1990 election, the Sandinistas, the incumbent ruling party, was voted out, right? And this was, you know, at that particular historical moment, widely seen as the voice of the Nicaraguan people exercising democratic rights. But the extent of American involvement in, over the course of the decade in this undeclared war on Nicaragua, and then in the lead up to the election in bringing the opposition together, funding the opposition, and maintaining the counter-revolutionary threat. This underscored the power of the democracy promotion initiative in advancing U.S. political and economic interests. Fourth, the democracy promotion initiative and just American democracy promotion as a foreign policy priority remained a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the early post-Cold War era. And so searching for a strategy that could replace Cold War containment, Bill Clinton turned to democratic enlargement. You see here from this quote from his State of the Union address. And similarly, George W. Bush, the emphasis on democracy promotion as the centerpiece of American human rights policy after the September 11, 2001 terror attacks, this served as an important rationale for the Bush administration's 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then it moved to center stage after the U.S. failed to find weapons of mass destruction. And so what you see here in this quote, it illuminates democracy promotion's durability as an appealing framework for U.S. foreign policy. And I think it's also important to point out that this it didn't just appeal to conservatives, but many liberals also perceived this as a benevolent role for the United States to play in the face of tyranny abroad. But the enormous human and material cost of U.S. interventionism in the Middle East, I think it really undercut Bush's lofty rhetoric. And we don't really know between 2003 and 2019, more than 7,000 U.S. soldiers serving in Iraq and Afghanistan were killed. Conservative estimates place the total number of direct war deaths at more than 450,000. The destabilization of the region in the aftermath of the U.S. invasion, from the rise of ISIS to the expanding influence of Iran, this would have, of course, a far-reaching geopolitical impact, and just the U.S. image abroad suffered irreparable damage as the Bush administration's effort to apprehend perceived terrorists metastasized into a massive and dysfunctional prison system in Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo Bay, and black sites where torture was the norm. And I think at both at home and abroad, the appeal of democracy promotion just plummeted. And the result, as a democracy scholar Thomas Carruthers has written, was that American democracy promotion needed to be decontaminated after Bush to remove the negative taint of U.S. foreign policy adventurism. And so by the end of the second Bush administration, it seemed that this triumphalism of the early post-war era had been, at the very best, premature. And as you know, Barack Obama faced a resurgent Russia, an increasingly ambitious China, and charismatic political leaders across the globe were tapping into widespread voter resentment toward the perceived ill effects of globalization, unchecked immigration, and the loss of tradition, propelling fragile democracies such as Turkey and Hungary toward authoritarianism, which democracy experts described as backsliding. And as Donald J. Trump's victory in the 2016 election made clear, right-wing populism was also a powerful force in the United States. What went wrong? Democracy specialist Larry Diamond wrote in the pages of Foreign Affairs in 2019. The answer, he concluded, lay close to home. In short, democracy lost its leading proponent, he asserted. Disastrous US interventions in the Middle East soured Americans on the idea of democracy promotion, and a combination of fears about democratic decline in their own country and economic problems encouraged them to turn inward. But such calls for the US to reconsecrate the mission of democracy promotion overlooked, I think, the interventionism that had underpinned the project in its foundational stages. The Reagan administration's use of democracy promotion and, more broadly, human rights to advance Cold War goals had set in motion a process that would culminate in tanks rolling down the streets of Baghdad. Moreover, the legacy of the Reagan administration's understanding of the free market as a defining human right and a key element of a functioning democracy had limited appeal for millions of people who felt left behind in a world increasingly defined by US-led globalization. In the late 20th century, democracy promotion had emerged as a signal feature of US foreign relations. Freedom is now on the offensive, Reagan had asserted in 1987. We turned a corner in 1981, and if we have courage and are realistic in our approach to world affairs, freedom will not only survive, it will triumph. But whether democracy promotion would continue to shape America's engagement with the world in the 20th century remains to be seen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I want to open up the floor to the audience, but before that, I am going to use my prerogative to ask the first question, or propose a comment ending in a question, I guess is what it is. Inspired by that picture, Saddam Hussein, the toppling of this statue. We've recently had a debate here in Denmark about statues and Ronald Reagan. There were those on the center right who proposed erecting a statue of Ronald Reagan as a sort of, hero, a beacon of freedom, human rights, etc. Those who favor that tend to focus on his policy towards the Soviet Union and sort of Eastern Europe and movements for civil liberties and human rights there. Those who oppose it, most of the people on the center left, tend to focus on, say, Nicaragua, Reagan's policy in Latin America and elsewhere. And certainly where you look on the globe would affect how you view Ronald Reagan. There's no coincidence that it's in Eastern Europe you find several statues of Ronald Reagan, and you find none at least not when I was in Nicaragua. I didn't see any, and that was no surprise. So with those two sort of opposing narratives, where do we stand if we want to sort of be truthful in our assessment of Reagan's legacy on human rights? You have the disingenuous, I would argue, application of human rights to his rollback communism policy in Latin America and elsewhere. And then you have his support to dissidents and minorities and activists in the Eastern Bloc. If we're trying to sort of strike a balance and sort of, was there any sincere commitment to human rights from Reagan, trying to pass out what were the actual motivations? Or was this idea of democracy promotion, human rights, just window dressing to justify anti-communism, or was there more to it? Do you want to sort of give us our take on that, and then I'll open it up to the floor?
Yeah, that's a great question, and just a quick apology for my microphone. I hope you could hear me. I mean, I think that I think the fundamental issue here is that what do human rights mean? Human rights are so malleable that they can mean things that are almost diametrically opposed and can be used in ways that are that seem to be on the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? And I think historians of human rights have made that point really clearly, that human rights are rooted in political contestations, and so in terms of, did the Reagan administration believe in human rights? There were certainly Reagan officials who just used the rhetoric of human rights to achieve political ends, right? And I'm thinking about Oliver North, for example, right? And yet at the same time, Oliver North really did believe that at some level he was promoting democracy and by extension sort of freedom, which he could connect to this broader understanding of human rights. I think that Reagan officials were certainly, Reagan himself certainly believed that the United States was a beacon of freedom, that American exceptionalism was real, that the American political rights and civil liberties could be understood as in a human rights framework. So in looking at East-West relations, human rights become a powerful weapon against the communist world, a powerful way of appealing to ordinary people on the other side of the Iron Curtain, right? The problem with Reagan's understanding of human rights is that it excluded social and economic rights entirely, and didn't connect with a broader, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international understandings of how human rights could operate outside of a very US-centric kind of framework, which is, I think, still the way the United States, for the most part, approaches human rights. There's a lot of US exceptionalism that goes into human rights as a US policy priority. Get my water.
My name is Kurt Jensen, and my question relates very much to the one put by our lecturer, and it all appears that the overall legacy of Ronald Reagan was winning the Cold War. The mean of doing that was a major build-up of military and so on, and he won the Cold War, and that is his legacy, I would argue. So taking that as the output, I also think that his major achievement was, by that winning the Cold War, he made it possible that the East European countries were freed, the Iron Curtain fell, and human rights and democracy was promoted in a big part of Europe. So I would like to hear if you agree, and that was his major achievement, also related to democracy and human rights.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, and a challenging question. I think it would be we would be going too far to equate the end of the Cold War with Reagan's foreign policy. And I think the debate then becomes, how important was Reagan in the Cold War ending when it did, and for my interests, how did human rights play into that? I think what you see in terms of the sort of broader trends, human rights is emerging as a powerful feature, a powerful mechanism for eliciting improvements from the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc over the course of the 1970s and through the 1980s, especially with the Helsinki process and the sort of trying to bind the Soviet Union to concrete improvements. The United States plays a role in that, but I think it's that's a very different process than the Reagan administration's view of human rights, and it's also a process that has a very important European component that the Reagan administration is often quite skeptical of, right? And certainly the way that Reagan understood détente, the way he understood the Helsinki Accords, he was very skeptical of that would have any positive outcomes for the United States in the Cold War. That said, Reagan, he does push human rights as a policy concern, especially on issues like the refuseniks, the right of immigration, this kind of thing. What I think is particularly significant is that he finds in Gorbachev a Soviet leader who's willing to take significant steps on human rights issues in ways that Gorbachev's predecessors would not, right? And so I think we certainly have to give a lot of attention to Gorbachev as an architect of the kinds of changes in human rights policy that contribute to the end of the Cold War. I think it's hard because when you think about Reagan's broader legacy, it's hard for me to say Reagan won the Cold War given this sort of broader framework that of changes in terms of globalization, the U.S. and the West's technological advances relative to the Soviet Union and its allies. These are like big systemic issues that go beyond the individual in really shaping change. And I think we also have to recognize that Reagan's promotion of these neoliberal economic policies had a very negative impact for much of the world, right? So if you look at Latin America in the 1980s, it's considered to be a lost decade. And then you see the application of those same kinds of policies to Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War, and it's no surprise that many Russians are supporting Putin, who they see as someone who can restore a certain amount of Russian power in the international arena, but also just sort of stabilize the economy, right? And so I think we have to be careful in thinking about Reagan as the sort of the individual who orchestrates the end of the Cold War, and that's sort of the end of the story.
Very good lecture, thank you. My question is regarding the foreign policy between the US and China. So since the Tiananmen incident, there have been a lot of critique of China, and it seems to be like arranged, orchestrated between the US and European states. So every time they had a top-level meeting with the Chinese, they put forward, you have to do something about human rights. But for me, I remember it's like that these voices were silenced in the period here in the 10s, maybe 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And then during Donald Trump, it kind of re-emerged a little, but maybe not to the same level that it used to be. So what happened? And America is still trying to promote human rights in China?
Yeah, another great question. Thank you. I mean, I think that the China case in looking at the late Cold War and early post-Cold War era, it shows how human rights is a concern in U.S. foreign policy, but U.S. officials are deciding, when to make it central, when to kind of push it to the back burner. The first Bush administration and the Clinton administration are, I think, very careful to not push human rights in a way that they felt would lessen the possibility of drawing China into this vision of an economic relationship that they thought would eventually lead to Chinese democratization, right? So Clinton in particular has this idea of, there is a direct relationship between, economic policy and democratization, which then leads to human rights, sort of the broader spectrum of human rights. And it really doesn't pan out in the case of China, right? That this vision of, if we can create these economic ties with China, eventually they'll sort of normalize and become like everybody else, and eventually democratize and support human rights. It really doesn't pan out. And in retrospect, I think that both Bush and Clinton missed opportunities to leverage human rights and say, okay, we're interested in economic exchange, but you have to meet certain thresholds, and sticking to that more forcefully. The Trump administration is an interesting case because Trump almost was in almost total disregard of human rights. He was on the campaign trail saying things like, torture works and we should be doing that. He was accusing immigrants coming over the U.S. southern border of being rapists. He was calling for a ban on Muslims to the United States. All of these things are just sort of obviously, they don't fit in a kind of human rights as a foreign policy priority framework. And in office, he followed through on those campaign promises with, building the wall and trying to ban Muslims, and so China's role in that is, I think, really interesting because, Trump certainly had an antagonistic relationship to China. I'm not sure that we can describe the sort of basis of Trump's policy toward China as having a connection to human rights, so much as this sense of an unequal trade relationship that China was basically winning, and so Trump's very transactional approach to foreign policy was very different from human rights taking center stage, or really any stage.
As a follow-up on your very thorough answer just now, where do you think the Biden administration fits into this? It looks to me as if they are once again probably, I would like to hear your view, weaponizing human rights, particularly in its vocabulary in relation to its relationship with China. And as a second question, maybe, is the good old Nixon, Kissinger realism forever dead?
Yeah, thank you. Let me first just say that the person you really should ask is Rasmus, who is far more of an expert on current U.S. foreign policy in relation to human rights than I am. I would say that Biden faces a real challenge in trying to given what happened under Trump and the sort of disregard of human rights, that poses a challenge in just sort of reconstructing the position of human rights, but also reconstructing the Foreign Service, right? The Trump administration took a huge toll on the workings of the Department of State, the number of high-level people, and that was a really traumatic 4 years for the U.S. foreign policy establishment. So Biden's first task is to try and sort of get back to this earlier era where at least human rights was infused in U.S. foreign policy, at least at a rhetorical level. I think that you know, the other challenge that Biden faces is as I mentioned, in the discussion of the U.S. invasion of Iraq and the occupation, that democracy promotion in particular, but also the U.S. as a kind of leader in terms of human rights, that has been called into question since the Bush administration in ways that really profound, right? And so I think that Biden has to navigate both the legacy of Trump, but also the longer legacy of the U.S. As a human rights violator rather than as a human rights promoter. These are big challenges, and I think that the tools that Biden is trying to work with are kind of the same old tools, right? That the vision that he has is really the same kind of framework as before. I mean, you have U.S. political aid, you have a giant military establishment, you have the U.S. and China increasingly facing off against each other. Within that playing field, it looks a lot like the same old. And so I'm not expecting anything particularly new. I think what is going to, the change will be sort of trying to get back to this earlier era where human rights was accepted as, yes, this should be a U.S. policy priority, and trying to get other nations to actually believe that the U.S. will advance that agenda.
If I was to just quickly supplement, I mean, I totally agree with that reading. What Biden is trying to do is undo the legacy of Trump, but also certainly Bush in relation to democracy promotion. That's why we heard him say there's no more nation building after the US pulled out of Afghanistan. That sort of idea of promoting democracy at the barrel of a gun and building up whole societies from scratch, that's in his vision is gone. He wants to get back to a much more minimalistic approach to it. But if in your talk you said it's freedom on the offensive in the Reagan era, the third wave of democratization, as Huntington put it, in the late 80s and up until the 90s, certainly now it's freedom on the defensive, right? It's democratic backsliding for the 15th consecutive year, according to Freedom House. It is the rise of authoritarian regimes, influence most importantly China, of course. And it's in that context that Biden is trying to sort of talking a lot like his predecessors pre-Trump, but reshaping it somewhat. And it also has to do, of course, with what happened in the US at home. America's own problems, being downgraded to a flawed democracy in some independent reports, the attack on Capitol Hill on January 6th this year. Those developments mean that Biden, I think, has tried to readjust this big ship that is US foreign policy in relation to democracy and human rights, and has sought to, at least in part, focus more inwards, be somewhat more modest and somewhat more humble about what needs to be done. This is what we see in the framing of the Summit for Democracy that he has called for December, which has a lot to do with looking inwards and trying to rebuild and improve. Whether that will succeed is a whole different matter, and there's a lot of domestic obstacles that prevent him from actually making meaningful domestic reforms that would address democratic shortcomings such as voter turnout, etc. in the US. But I think there is that shift, when at the same time you do have, as you point out, you do have also the China threat and the sort of whole framing of US foreign policy around China, and his talk of the 21st century being a contest between democracy and autocracy for the future of the world and all that. So you still have that sort of antagonistic, aggressive, anti-China instead of anti-Soviet in the times of Reagan. You still have that sort of externally focused sort of ideological confrontation. But you also have that supplemented with a more humble, inward-looking attempt to rebuild. And I think that's the change from Reagan and I would say Clinton, Bush, etc. A greater acknowledgement of own shortcomings, along with a continued attempt to use it as an ideological weapon against your peer competitor.
Yeah, my name is Emmanuel. I have only one or two questions. which country has the right to promote human rights in the world? Which one? And as far as I know, that universal human right had been declared 1948, right? So before the year 1948, does it mean that in the world you had no human rights before that year? And how was it exactly?
Thank you. Yeah, great questions. Let me take your second question first, which is how do we understand the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and especially sort of before that declaration. There are scholars who argue that there is a kind of, a line that goes back, way back to, you can find it, you can make connections to the Code of Hammurabi or to the Bible or to Buddhism and draw that through important moments like the Magna Carta or the Napoleonic legal code, right? That this sort of long process leads to the culmination of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think that that's accurate to a certain extent in that, there have been rights-based struggles throughout human history. But what happens in the mid-20th century is that this notion of human rights becomes really it's building on these earlier struggles, but it is articulated in a new way. And it has to do with, for example, in the United States, the Great Depression, right? The Great Depression is such a terrible economic downturn that it changes the way people start thinking about their relationship to the state and their relationship to other humans, right? It also has to do with the Second World War, right? The fight against fascism in Europe and imperialism in Asia. The idea of, what are we fighting against? It becomes articulated increasingly as, what are we fighting for? And this engenders an idea that is sort of the, evolving into what becomes known as, the sort of modern notion of human rights. And what the Universal Declaration does is it establishes this set of rights that are aspirational, right? That peoples and nations can aspire to. But of course, it's a very politicized process. And so you can see the connections to earlier ideas about rights, but it also is very rooted in that historical moment. And so when I teach human rights history, the sort of foundational point that I argue is that when we talk about modern human rights, we can't separate them from the political battles that are always circulating around those rights-based struggles. And in response to your question, what nation has the right or to promote human rights, I think is how you phrased it. I mean, you could make the case that all peoples have the duty to protect human rights. At the same time, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it clearly states you can't promote human rights if you then violate one of these other rights. And so it's in the case of the Reagan administration, it becomes very controversial that the Reagan administration is in the name of democracy promotion, in the name of human rights, supporting counter-revolutionaries that are violating human rights. And so, again, I don't think we can think of human rights as something up in the sky, right? Something that's sort of reified, that is a sort of universal truth. Instead, we have to see them as part of, the sort of political battles that in the mid-20th century create this new framework for imagining, each other and the world.
Just quickly to your last question there. I mean, it's a good question, right? And you can't really answer it properly based on any sort of, I think, legal arguments. But I would say that from Reagan's perspective, and this is the problem, and this is not a view that I share, but from Reagan's perspective, the US is exceptional and therefore has the right. That is the logic that is being applied from the Reagan administration. This idea that the US, because of the way it was created and special characteristics as a liberal democracy, somehow it has the ability to see further than the rest of us and will therefore have an obligation and also the necessary foresight and the power, etc., to act on behalf of mankind at large. That is the sort of mindset and logic that's behind it. And I'm not subscribing to it. I'm just saying that American exceptionalism is the notion that for Reagan and many other American advocates of human rights answers the question, who has the right? With an affirmative, the US has the right. And on the whole question of the Universal Declaration, I mean, I think the word, we have other people here in the audience who are much bigger experts on that actually, but it's the universal part that is key here. If we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in comparison to previous articulations of human rights, the previous ones have tended to be structured around a national space or a certain group of individuals, excluding some members of society and certainly excluding people outside of the national boundaries. So the rights of French people in the French Revolution were tied to Frenchmen and men and women, etc. And there was some context there, so some limitations to the way rights were understood prior to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where with the Universal Declaration, at least in principle, the idea is that the rights are universal and shared by everyone. And finally, there was after World War I, when the powers come together to try and determine how do we prevent this from happening again and how do we address the violations of rights that had occurred, they focus on minority rights. They focus on groups, not individuals. So the notion of who has rights prior to the Universal Declaration of Rights is often also connected to group identities, minority rights, etc., rather than the right of individuals on a universal basis. So there are some developments there that until the Universal Declaration of Rights, we see various notions of rights, but they are rarely applied on a universal scale, and they are not necessarily always tied to the individual, but often tied to the group. There's some distinctions there.
Hello, my name is Sarai Sama. I am wondering because I have heard that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights established in 1948 in order to protect human rights, and still wonder until now why during 1975 till 1979 it's in Cambodia there was genocide and there is no international United Nations intervention to protect the people that was killed in that time. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think the short answer to that is that the situation in Cambodia was linked to U.S. policy toward Vietnam in the aftermath, the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War, and also U.S. policy toward China, right? And so the United States is looking at the situation. How can we keep the pressure on Vietnam? As you know, we just fought this 20-year war that's come to an end, but we're certainly not going to, we're going to try to keep the pressure on at a certain level. And also that's the part of the U.S. effort to normalize relations with China, right? That China's, so in that framework, the Khmer Rouge is seen as a rogue actor, but the United States is looking at the region from a sort of broader geopolitical perspective, And even though this is during the Carter years, where Carter is supposed to be the human rights president, right? He makes this sort of cold-hearted decision to, do very little in terms of stopping the genocide that was happening in the interest of these broader considerations toward Vietnam and toward China. And again, I think that this is an important episode in underscoring the, that human rights has never been the defining feature of U.S. foreign policy, and that it's applied on a case-by-case basis, even in times when presidents are trying to position themselves as having a robust human rights policy. And certainly that that there has been a lot of scholarship on that case study to demonstrate both the sort of the limits of U.S. human rights policy and even in the Carter administration, at the same time that the Carter administration was pushing this idea that human rights would be really defining.
I will like to ask the definition of human rights, the basic universal definition of human rights, what is? And do you think in various parts of the world that there are different definitions applying over the various issues? Some of the issues are dead, and some of the issues are very highlighted in the media and some other forums. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's a really difficult question, actually. It's very simple, but actually very, very difficult. I think in terms of different conceptions of rights, one of the things that the Universal Declaration, one of its limitations is that it's a set number of articles, right? And so when I have my students read, read the Universal Declaration, one of the things that they always point to is that gender is not really there. Women are there to a certain extent, but the importance now of the LGBTQ community is really left out of the Universal Declaration. Other issues that are really important, like self-determination. So the Universal Declaration can be understood as constraining our understanding of human rights, but it can also be understood as a kind of foundation on which an understanding of human rights can be built, and also that our understanding of human rights can be expanded. And I think that you see that happening in interesting ways. For example, indigenous rights, can pull from the Universal Declaration, but not claim exactly the same kinds of things that are in there, right? So it has this malleability. Human rights as a whole, it can be sort of stretched and pulled, and that's what gives it its power at some level, because it has become this idea that we all can at some level speak to. We all understand it in a very thin way, like human rights is something that has become almost universal as a concept. But then when we thicken it and we talk about the specifics of how it plays out in a given situation, then it becomes much more controversial. And in that way, I think it has an enormous amount of power as a way of getting people organized and making claims around rights. But it also, has the potential to create conflict when, that very malleability creates very different ideas of what rights mean in practice. Please.
But it looks like that human rights it is used to be as a tool. It is used to be as a tool to give some certain advantages by the certain peoples or the powers in certain scenarios or criterias. Is it true?
Well, certainly, when we're talking about the George W. Bush administration using this kind of rhetoric around, the fight against tyranny and the importance of promoting democracy, you can see how that language that's connected to human rights is, someone mentioned this earlier, being weaponized in effect, right? And that's certainly possible, and it's certainly evident in those cases. But I don't think that that's always the case, and I don't think that human rights only lead to those kinds of outcomes. I think what makes it such a powerful concept is also the way that it can be deployed against foreign policy, interventionism or adventurism, the way that it can be used, to as a way of bringing pressure on human rights violators, and so I think when we look at human rights history, certainly there are many instances when it is instrumentalized to justify a political objective. But there are also many cases where, and especially I would say, from grassroots organizing and non-governmental organizations, activism, that human rights can be a mechanism, a vehicle for positive change.
Just briefly add then that it is a tool, I would argue, and that's why I try to argue in my book on Reagan and human rights. It is to some extent a tool, but what matters is what it's applied towards, right? Like, of course, human rights are many things. It's law, it's social movements, it's a language, but as a political language, it will always serve the purpose of those who invoke it, right? So whether you're a social group opposing apartheid in South Africa, which is a case that I have looked at, invoking human rights concerns to demand a change in that regime, then it's being invoked as a tool to oppose an apartheid regime, for instance. But it can also be invoked by the Reagan administration to justify support for right-wing regimes in the name of anti-communism, as long as the logic is applied that anti-communism is the way of promoting human rights, right? So it can always be, it is a tool, right? The Trump administration tried to redefine human rights as religious freedom and the right to private property. They had a commission set up with human rights scholars, and that was their definition. That is what human rights are, according to the Trump administration. So it's always a tool, or always redefined for the purpose of serving a certain political agenda. So in that sense, it is a tool. When you study it as a social concept that's invoked by actors to get what they want in the world, then of course it is a tool. But it's more than that as well, and it's often also genuine. So that's the challenge of studying it as a concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I don't see any further questions. Last chance. All right. Then please help me give a round of applause to Mike.
Thank you.
And thanks to everyone for your questions and for showing up. And thanks to you watching at home as well. Hope you enjoyed it.